After you fell in this arena, a man dressed as Mercury, the Roman god who guided souls to the underworld, walked over to your body and pressed a red-hot piece of metal into your flesh. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was a quality check. If you flinched, if your muscles seized, if any sign of life remained, a second man dressed as Charon, ferryman of the dead, stepped forward and caved in your skull with a giant mace. Your corpse was then dragged through a gate named after the goddess of funerals, hauled into a nearby building called the Spoliarium, and stripped of every piece of armor, every weapon, and every scrap of clothing you had fought in. That was the checkout procedure at the Roman Colosseum, and it was, by a wide margin, the least horrible part of your day. Because this is the story of what it actually meant to fight as a gladiator in Rome's most famous arena. Not the Hollywood version, not the sanitized museum plaque version, but the version built from bones, grave markers, and the casual observations of Roman writers who described human slaughter with the same emotional register you or I might use to review a restaurant. If you think you could have survived 24 hours in the Colosseum, you are about to reconsider. The building itself was designed to intimidate you before the fighting even started. Emperor Vespasian began construction in around 70 AD, funding the entire project with treasure looted from the Jewish temple after the sack of Jerusalem. The actual labor fell to an estimated 60,000 to 100,000 Jewish slaves, who spent nearly a decade hauling 3.5 million cubic feet of travertine stone, along with staggering quantities of marble, concrete, and timber. The finished structure rose 157 feet into the sky, roughly the height of a 15-story building, at a time when most Romans lived in single-story dwellings. Its oval footprint covered 6 acres, stretching 620 feet along its main axis and 513 feet across, almost twice as long and 1.5 times as wide as a modern football field. Standing at the base of the Colosseum and looking up for the first time produced the same sensation a person today might feel standing at the foot of the Empire State Building. 80 numbered entrances and exits channeled crowds in and out with an efficiency that modern stadium engineers still study. On game day, somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators, packed into tiered seats arranged by strict social class, with senators at the bottom, knights above them, common citizens higher still, and women banished to the wooden benches at the very top. The emperor himself arrived through a private tunnel that allowed him to bypass the crowds entirely, because even the man who ordered the killing preferred not to mingle with the people who enjoyed watching it. Titus, Vespasian's son, opened the Colosseum in 80 AD with a 100-day festival of games. During that inaugural celebration, the Roman historian Dio Cassius recorded that over 9,000 wild animals were killed. A generation later, Emperor Trajan celebrated his conquest of Dacia with 123 days of games that claimed 11,000 animals. Lions shipped from North Africa, bears transported from Scotland and Hungary, tigers hauled from Persia, crocodiles dragged from Egypt, and rhinoceroses imported from India all met their end on the sand floor of the arena. By the time the games were finally outlawed centuries later, entire species had vanished from North Africa and Scotland. The Romans did not just enjoy blood sport. They industrialized extinction. But the animals were only the warm-up act. The real draw, the reason tens of thousands of Romans scheduled their entire social calendar around game day, was watching people like you fight and bleed, and, on a regular basis, die. So how did you end up here in the first place? Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or convicted criminals sentenced to the arena. You did not apply. You were acquired. was a trainer called a lanista purchased you, owned you, and managed your career the way a modern agent manages a fighter, except the lanista's social status ranked somewhere around that of a pimp. The Roman term for lanista literally translated to vendor of human flesh, and Roman society viewed the profession with the same blend of fascination and disgust. Your new owner ran a ludus, a gladiator school, and the most famous of these stood right next to the Colosseum itself. The Ludus Magnus connected to the arena through an underground passage and featured its own miniature training arena, which Roman citizens would actually visit to watch gladiators practice, because apparently the scheduled killing wasn't enough and they needed previews. A smaller number of gladiators were free men who volunteered, known as octorati. These were often citizens drowning in debt or simply desperate enough to sell their bodies and their freedom for a shot at prize money and fame. One Roman citizen named Marcus Attilius entered gladiator school specifically to pay off heavy debts. In his very first fight, he defeated Hilarus, a gladiator owned by Nero, who had won 13 consecutive bouts. He then defeated Ratius Felix, who carried a 12-fight winning streak. Attilius walked in as a debtor. He walked out as a legend. But here is the thing about volunteers. No matter your reason for signing up, the moment you entered the school, you ceased to be a person in the eyes of the law. All arena fighters were classified as infams, a legal designation meaning socially disgraced. You lost most of the advantages and rights of citizenship. You were, that in every way that mattered to Roman society, somebody who no longer counted. And then the training began. Life inside the ludus resembled a strange hybrid of prison and professional athletic facility. Free men who volunteered were still locked in shackles. Speaking at meal times was forbidden. The daily schedule was grueling and inflexible. But you received 3 meals a day and access to the best medical care available in the ancient world. The physician Galen, one of the most important medical minds in history, spent years tending to gladiators in Pergamon. Under his watch, only 5 gladiators died, compared to 60 under his predecessor, a survival rate he achieved simply by paying closer attention to wound treatment. Gladiator schools understood that training and maintaining a stable of fighters cost serious money, and dead gladiators generated no revenue. You were an investment, a battered, shackled, legally disgraced investment, but an investment all the same. Your diet reflected this. Gladiators ate a high-energy, almost entirely vegetarian regimen of barley, boiled beans, oatmeal, ash, and dried fruit. They were sometimes mocked as hordearii, which translates to barley eaters. The goal was not to sculpt the lean, muscular physique you have seen in every gladiator film ever made. The goal was fat. Forensic researcher Grossschmidt explained that gladiators needed subcutaneous fat because a fat cushion protects you from cut wounds and shields nerves and blood vessels during a fight. And a layer of fat over your torso and limbs meant a shallow sword strike would produce a spectacular spray of blood for the crowd without actually severing anything that would kill you or end your career. You bled impressively. You kept fighting. The audience marveled at your toughness. The fat did its job. To strengthen your bones on top of all that padding, you drank a mixture made from the ashes of charred bones and wood. The recipe has not made it into any modern sports nutrition guides. Training sessions consumed hours every day. You practiced with wooden swords deliberately weighted to be twice as heavy as the real metal weapons you would use in the arena, and shields heavier than those carried in actual combat. The logic was straightforward. If you could fight effectively with equipment that heavy, whilst the real weapons would feel muscle almost light by comparison. Historical consultant Alexander Mariotti has emphasized that training was critical because combat, especially with weaponry, triggers the fight-or-flight response, and the entire point of the school was to condition that reflex out of you. A gladiator who panicked died. A gladiator who stayed calm, who moved with trained precision under the screaming of 80,000 spectators and the specific terror of another human being trying to open your body with sharpened metal, had a chance of walking out alive. There were over 24 different classes of gladiator, each defined by a specific combination of weapons, armor, and fighting style. The pairings were never random. Roman organizers matched fighters from different classes against each other to create a deliberate imbalance, not because an even fight is boring and an uneven fight is a spectacle. The retiarius carried a trident and a dagger, wore no helmet, and had almost no body armor beyond a guard on his left arm and shoulder. He relied entirely on speed, distance, and a weighted net he used to tangle his opponent. Facing him stood the secutor, encased in heavy armor, with a smooth, rounded helmet that featured only 2 tiny eye holes, designed to prevent the trident's prongs from reaching the face and to stop the net from catching on any surface. The trade-off was suffocation. The secutor's helmet severely restricted airflow, meaning every second the fight dragged on pushed him closer to exhaustion and heat collapse. Romans framed this matchup as an elemental clash between Vulcan, god of fire, and Neptune, god of the sea. The Thraex wielded a curved psyker blade that could hook around the edge of an opponent's shield to strike exposed flesh on the other side. The Dimachari carried 2 short curved blades. The Equites fought on horseback. The Essadarii rode chariots. The Laqueatores hunted their opponents across the arena floor with lassos and daggers, which is the kind of detail that sounds invented, but is not. And Romans found the results endlessly amusing. The gladiator class with the highest win rate turned out to be the nearly naked retiarius, which deeply embarrassed Roman audiences, because the retiarius was considered the most effeminate of all fighters. Without a helmet, his expressions of pain and fear were visible to everyone, and his entire strategy revolved around dodging rather than standing and taking hits like a proper Roman combatant. Was he won more than anyone, and they mocked him for it. That tells you everything you need to know about Roman values. Now, as bad as all of this sounds, we have not even gotten to what happened on the actual day of the games. And trust me, everything up to this point has been the comfortable part. The night before the Munus, you were given a banquet, good food, decent wine, and the opportunity to order your personal affairs, settle debts, say goodbye to anyone who mattered. The historian Futrell compared this meal to a ritualistic Last Supper, a sacramental farewell to the living world. You ate knowing that by this time tomorrow, you might be a corpse stripped naked in the spoliarium. Some of the men sitting beside you at that table would not survive the next afternoon. And you did not know which ones. The morning of the games belonged to the animals. Exotic beasts were hauled up from the Hypogeum, a massive 2-level underground network of tunnels, cages, and corridors spanning 15,000 square meters beneath the arena floor. 80 wooden freight elevators, each operated by teams of 8 men, lifted half-ton cages to the surface through trapdoors in the sand. The beasts emerged into blinding sunlight and the roar of tens of thousands of spectators. Condemned criminals, the damnati, were released into the arena alongside them, sometimes armed with nothing, sometimes given only the most basic weapons and expected to die. Others were executed in what one modern scholar called fatal charades, staged killings designed to recreate scenes from mythology. The Roman poet Martial described one such performance in which a criminal dressed as Orpheus was torn apart by a bear. The The crowd treated this as entertainment. By midday, the sand was soaked. Your turn came in the afternoon. A procession entered the arena, led by lictors carrying the fasces, the bundles of rods that symbolized the authorities' power over life and death. Trumpeters played a fanfare. Images of the gods were carried in to witness the proceedings, because even the divine needed a good seat. A scribe followed, tasked with recording the outcome of each fight, and behind him walked a man carrying the palm branch that would be awarded to the victor. Then you walked through the Porta Triumphalis, the gate of triumph, and stepped onto the sand. The gladiator's oath, recorded by the Roman writer Petronius, had laid out exactly what you had agreed to the moment you entered that arena. He vows to endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. That was the contract. Not he vows to fight bravely, or he vows to entertain the crowd. He vows to endure every form of suffering the arena could deliver, including death. You signed that with your body. During the 1st century AD, a gladiator who stepped onto the sand had roughly a 10% chance of dying in any given bout. If you lost the fight, those odds jumped to 25%. The researcher George Veal, using evidence from 1st century gladiator headstones, calculated an average age at death of 27 and an overall mortality rate among all arena fighters of 19 per 100. Most gladiators died between their 20th and 30th birthday, or typically after somewhere between 5 and 34 fights. Few survived more than 10 contests. One anomaly survived 150 bouts. Another supposedly lived to 90, presumably long after retirement. These were not the norm. These were statistical miracles in a profession that killed young men at an industrial pace. If you lost your fight but were still alive, the decision of whether you lived or died rested on a combination of crowd noise and the personal whim of whoever organized the games. You raised your right index finger, the gesture called ad digitum, to signal surrender. The crowd screamed. Some shouted missio, meaning release him. Others screamed iugula, meaning kill him. Veterans who had fought many times and built a loyal following could count on fan support when this moment came. A first-time fighter had no such safety net. You were unknown. You were cheap to replace. Your worth was measured in how much it would cost to buy another body to take your place. And the answer was usually not much. The famous thumbs gesture you have seen in every painting and film about this moment is, ironically, one of the most misunderstood images in all of history. The precise meaning of police verso, the turned thumb, remains the subject of active scholarly debate. Nobody actually knows whether the thumb went up, went down, went sideways, or was tucked inside the fist to signal life or death. What classicist Anthony Corbeil has argued is that the extended thumb mimicked the motion of a sword being thrust downward, representing the blade driving into the fallen gladiator's body. The thumbs up, in ancient Rome, was known as infestus pollex, the hostile thumb, essentially the Roman equivalent of a raised middle finger. So the next time you give someone a cheerful thumbs up, know that in Rome, you would have just told them to die. Not every fight ended in death, and over the centuries, the kill rate actually declined. In the early days of the Colosseum, more contests ended fatally. But as the cost of training and maintaining gladiators rose, organizers grew reluctant to throw away their investments over a single afternoon's entertainment. Emperor Augustus absorbed gladiatorial combat into the state system, and according to the biographer Suetonius, outright banned fights where no quarter was given. When later emperors like Caligula and Claudius refused to spare popular fighters, their own approval ratings suffered. The crowd wanted blood, but they also had favorites, and killing a fan favorite was bad politics. The Syrian gladiator Flamma understood this dynamic better than most. Across 34 fights, he won 21, drew 9, and lost 4. He was offered his freedom 4 separate times. 4 times, he turned it down and walked back into the arena. His gravestone in Sicily records that he died at 30, still fighting. Freedom, for some gladiators, held less appeal than the roar. The gladiator Spiculus became so famous that Emperor Nero lavished him with gifts, including an entire palace, placing a technically enslaved man in a lifestyle that rivaled the aristocracy. When Nero's reign collapsed in 68 AD and the emperor faced certain death, he sent for Spiculus to execute him. Spiculus either never received the message or refused. Nero killed himself, and Roman citizens then uprooted Nero's statues and, according to Plutarch, used them to crush Spiculus to death in the streets. Fame, it turned out, was its own kind of cage. One of the most celebrated bouts in the Colosseum's history was the fight between Priscus and Verus, reportedly the first gladiatorial contest held in the Flavian amphitheater itself. The 2 men fought for hours. Neither could break the other. And then, in a moment that the crowd apparently never forgot, both gladiators conceded to each other at the same time. Emperor Titus awarded each of them the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom, and both men walked out of the arena side by side as free men. It is one of the only stories from the Colosseum that sounds like it belongs in a film. The rest belong in a coroner's report. Because for every Priscus and Verus, there were hundreds of nameless fighters whose bones tell a far grimmer story. The best-known gladiator cemetery, excavated at Ephesus, contained the remains of at least 68 individuals. 11 showed evidence of healed skull fractures from earlier fights, proof they had survived previous blows to the head. 10 had cranial injuries that occurred around the time of death, consistent with the killing blows described in Roman texts. 3 of those skulls had been punctured by tridents. 10 had been caved in by blunt objects, likely mercy blows delivered with a hammer after the fight was already decided. In York, England, a skeleton discovered at a Roman burial site revealed a man who stood about 5 feet 8 inches tall, whose bones showed the marks of powerful muscles, combat injuries to the shoulder and spine, and bite wounds on his pelvis consistent with the jaws of a large cat. Osteoarchaeologist Marlin Holst, who analyzed the remains, said in 30 years of studying skeletons, she had never seen anything like those bite marks. The man's severed head had been placed back on his shoulders after death, a departure from the usual Roman practice of positioning the head between the feet. Someone had given him a different burial. Whether that was respect or something else entirely, nobody knows. Emperor Commodus sits in a category all his own. He reportedly entered the arena 735 times, fighting animals and occasionally other gladiators. The historian Herodian noted that no rival fighter dared actually wound or kill a reigning emperor, because injuring Commodus seemed like a guaranteed path to their own execution. To make things even less sporting, Commodus usually fought gladiators armed only with wooden swords and killed wild animals that were tethered or already injured. He then charged the state 1 million sesterces for every appearance, although, as the sources note, he was never exactly invited. The Roman people watched their emperor play act at being a gladiator in the same arena where real men died every week. Nobody laughed, at least not where he could hear them. Even after you died, Rome was not finished with you. Gladiator blood was collected and sold as an aphrodisiac. On her wedding night, a young Roman bride might have her hair parted using a sword dipped in the blood of a dead gladiator, a ritual believed to guarantee a long and fruitful marriage. But after fights and training sessions, gladiators scraped their skin with a curved metal tool called a strigul, removing a paste of sweat, oil, and dirt. This mixture, known as Gladiator ungentum, was bottled, sold, and purchased by Roman women who believed it had cosmetic and aphrodisiac properties. Your sweat was a beauty product. Your blood was a wedding accessory. Your body, alive or dead, belonged to Rome. Gladiatorial combat survived for over 650 years. From the first recorded contest in 264 BC, when two sons organized a fight to honor their dead father, to the final games on January 1st, 404 AD, the arena consumed lives across more than 6 centuries. Modern estimates suggest that roughly 400,000 gladiators died across all Roman arenas, thus with tens of thousands of those deaths occurring inside the Colosseum during its active years. Some historians push the combined toll of gladiators and condemned prisoners killed in the Colosseum alone to 400,000 people, alongside approximately 1 million animals. The end came because of a monk named Telemachus. According to the church historian Theodoret, Telemachus walked into the arena during the games on that January day in 404, stepped onto the sand, and physically tried to stop the gladiators from fighting each other. The crowd, furious at the interruption of their entertainment, stoned him to death on the spot. Emperor Honorius, upon hearing of the monk's death, declared Telemachus a martyr and officially ended the gladiatorial games for good. It took a man being murdered by spectators for trying to prevent murder in order to convince Rome that maybe the murdering should stop. So here is what 24 hours in the Colosseum actually looked like for you. You woke up in a gladiator school where you had spent months, sleeping in shackles, eating barley and drinking bone ash, training with weapons twice the weight of the ones you would actually use, all while carrying the legal status of someone who barely qualified as human. The night before your fight, you sat at a banquet that everyone present understood might be your last meal, surrounded by other men doing the same grim arithmetic in their heads. The morning of the games, you listened from beneath the arena as animals tore condemned prisoners apart on the sand above you, while 80 wooden elevators groaned and creaked around you, hauling cages full of lions and bears up through trap doors into the daylight. Sailors from the naval fleet at Misenum worked the ropes of a massive awning called the velarium high above the crowd, a retractable shade system so complex it took up to 1,000 men several days to assemble, because even the spectators watching you die deserved protection from the sun. You walked through the Porta Triumphalis into an arena that held more people than most modern concert venues, every one of them screaming, and you faced an opponent carrying weapons specifically designed to exploit the gaps in your armor. If you won, you received a palm branch and lived to do it again in a few months. If you lost but fought well, you raised a finger and prayed the crowd liked you enough to scream for mercy. If you lost and the crowd stayed silent, or worse, screamed for your death, a man dressed as a god pressed hot metal into your body to check if you were still alive, and another man dressed as a different god smashed your skull with a mace to make sure you weren't. Your body was dragged out through the gate of the funeral goddess. Your armor was stripped. Your blood was bottled. Your sweat had already been sold. The typical gladiator fought 2 or 3 times a year and died on average at 27. An unknown number never made it past their first bout. The Colosseum still stands today, visited by more than 7 million people a year, who walk through the same gates and stand on the same stone where all of this happened, and it generates over $63 million annually in ticket revenue, making it the highest-earning tourist attraction in Italy. Portraits of famous gladiators once hung in public spaces across Rome. Children made clay figurines of their favorite fighters. The best gladiators endorsed products. 17 centuries later, tourists buy refrigerator magnets of the building where those men were butchered, and not a single one of them picks up a souvenir and thinks about the gladiator whose oath promised he would endure being burned, bound, beaten, and killed. The Colosseum was never a monument. It was a machine designed to turn human bodies into public spectacle. And it ran for over 300 years without anyone in Rome seriously asking whether it should be turned off. You would not have lasted 24 hours inside it. And the truly unsettling part is that 50,000 Romans would have watched you fail, and they would have loved every second of it.